The skies over Europe in 1943 were no place for mercy. Above the thunder of artillery and the endless churn of armoured columns below, another war raged, one measured not in trenches or territory, but in altitude, horsepower, and sheer velocity. German fighter aces flew with cold precision, their Messerschmitt Bf 109S and Focke-Wulf 190S slicing through the clouds like predators. And in the early months of America's air campaign, their prey often came easily. The lumbering US bombers flying fortresses and liberators could not always rely on their escorts to protect them deep over enemy skies. At the time, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, America's heavyweight fighter, was a paradox. Massive, durable, armed to the teeth, but also sluggish, thirsty, and lacking the reach to follow bombers into Germany. Luftwaffe pilots mocked it as a flying jug. Yet, what Germany never expected was that a single radical change, an innovation as simple as reshaping a propeller blade, would unlock the monster sleeping inside the jug. The paddle blade propeller. It transformed the Thunderbolt into a predator of its own, capable of 470 miles per hour, able to dive like a falcon and climb with fury. Suddenly the skies shifted. To the Germans, it was unthinkable. To the Americans, it was salvation. But the journey to that transformation was neither inevitable nor smooth. It was paid for in blood, in desperate experiments, and in the courage of pilots who flew into impossible odds before the solution arrived. This is the story of how the jug, mocked for its size, became the very hammer that smashed Germany's aerial dominance. But to understand that turning point, we must return to the desperate days of 1943. When bombers fell like burning comets, and victory in the air seemed a distant dream. By 1942, the United States had joined Britain in a daunting mission, daylight precision bombing of Nazi Germany. The goal was simple on paper: destroy factories, cripple oil refineries, strike at the very heart of Hitler's war machine. But the reality was anything but simple. The Luftwaffe stood ready. German air defenses were layered like steel rings around the Reich, radar networks, flak batteries, and fighter wings of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs. Every American bomber that crossed the Channel entered a gauntlet of fire and steel. And the escorts? That was the problem. The RAF's Spitfires, though nimble, lacked range to protect bombers beyond the coast. The US Army Air Forces needed something tougher, something that could fight its way deep into enemy skies. Enter the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. Designed by Alexander Kartveli, the Thunderbolt was the largest single-engine fighter of the war. It was built around the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an air-cooled radial engine so powerful it seemed almost absurd for a fighter plane. 8.50 caliber machine guns gave it teeth enough to shred anything in its sights, and its armor made it nearly indestructible. Pilots loved its toughness. One said, "She could take more punishment than anything else up there. She brought me home with holes big enough to stick my arm through." But toughness came with a price. The jug was heavy, over 14,000 pounds fully loaded. Its climb rate lagged. Against a nimble German fighter, the P-47 struggled to keep up. And perhaps worst of all, its range was limited, barely enough to cover bombers on the edge of Germany, never enough to escort them to Berlin. By mid-1943, these shortcomings were deadly. On missions like the raids over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, bomber losses were catastrophic. Entire formations were ripped apart before the Thunderbolts could even arrive. To Germany, it seemed the equation was simple. They held the skies, and they would hold them until America bled out. But deep inside Republic's factories and testing grounds, engineers and pilots were already searching for answers. If the jug could be unleashed, if its hidden power could somehow be tapped, it might yet change the balance of the air war. That answer would come not in a radical redesign, but in something deceptively small. The propeller itself, the blades that turned all of that immense horsepower into thrust, was strangling the jug's potential. The realization was about to set the stage for a revolution that would turn a lumbering giant into a 470 miles per hour monster. Every machine of war is only as great as the men who fly it, and in 1943, those men were boys barely out of high school, thrust into the crucible of Europe's skies. Letters home reveal the mixture of courage and doubt that haunted them. Lieutenant Robert Bob Johnson, one of the first great Thunderbolt aces, wrote, "I do not fear the enemy so much as I fear letting my comrades down. Each mission I ask myself, will this be the one where my luck runs out?" For new pilots arriving in England, the Thunderbolt was both a source of pride and a curse. They admired its armor, the way it could absorb punishment no other fighter could. One pilot recalled landing with a cockpit dripping with fuel, holes in the wings, and half the tail missing, yet the jug still brought me home. But they also cursed its weaknesses. German fighters could climb past them, roll tighter, and vanish before a jug could catch them. In the words of one frustrated airman, "We spur flying anvils with wings. By the time I point my nose up, Jerry is already gone." And then there were the bomber crews. The men of the B-17 SWI and B-24s looked to their escorts with desperate hope. They knew the Thunderbolts could fight, but they also knew the fighters couldn't always stay with them. Too often, they watched their guardians peel away, forced to turn back for fuel, leaving them exposed over the heart of Germany. The human cost was staggering. On the infamous Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid in August 1943, 60 bombers were lost in a single day, hundreds of airmen killed or captured. Survivors returned shaken, eyes hollow. A bomber gunner described the moment when the escorts left. The P-47 Thunderbolt turned for home. We waved, then the sky emptied, except for us. The Germans came like hawks. It felt like waiting for wolves in the dark. For the young Thunderbolt pilots, these words cut deep. They weren't cowards. They were trapped by the limits of their machine. They needed more speed, more climb, more reach. They needed the jug to become what they knew it could be. And quietly, in hangars and testing fields, engineers were listening. They pored over flight reports, scrawled notes on propeller tests, and began to see a pattern. The jug's heart, the mighty R2800 engine, was straining against the very propeller meant to harness it. The narrow blades simply couldn't absorb all that power. At high altitudes, the engine roared, but the plane lagged. If the Thunderbolt's full strength could be unleashed, these young men might finally stand a chance. The solution was close. But in the meantime, every mission was a gamble, every flight another letter that might never reach home. And with Germany still ruling the skies, the gamble was only getting deadlier. The summer and fall of 1943 became a trial by fire for the US Army Air Forces. Each daylight raid into Germany tested the theory of precision bombing and tested the men who carried it out. The promise was bold, that American bombers flying in tight box formations could fight their way through German defenses and destroy critical war industries. The reality was brutal. Wave after wave of Luftwaffe fighters slicing through the formations, tearing them apart before they ever reached their targets. The Luftwaffe was a force honed by years of war. Veteran aces like Adolf Galland and Walter Nomi led wings of Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, men who had survived the Battle of Britain and the Eastern Front. They were skilled, ruthless, and confident. To them, the bombers were lumbering prey. And the Thunderbolts, though brave, were not enough. One mission after another, the pattern repeated. Escorts flew as far as they could, but fuel forced them home. The bombers pressed on, alone into the storm. The Schweinfurt raids in August and October became grim symbols of this failure. On the second raid, October 14th, 1943, later called Black Thursday, the Luftwaffe unleashed hell. Of 291 B-17 sent, 60 were destroyed. Hundreds of men never returned. It was a loss rate so high that even the most hardened generals questioned if the daylight campaign could continue. For the Thunderbolt pilots, frustration boiled. They could fight fiercely when they met the enemy, but they could not protect the bombers when it mattered most. The jug's climb rate lagged behind. In a high-speed chase, the Germans often dictated the fight. Letters home spoke of exhaustion, of guilt. One pilot confessed, "I can still see them falling in flames, knowing we could not stay with them. I wonder if their mothers will ever know how hard we tried." Meanwhile, in the factories and test centers back in the United States, Engineers studied these reports with mounting urgency. The Thunderbolt's engine was capable of far more than the airframe was delivering. The propeller, the very blades that turned raw horsepower into thrust, was choking its potential. Traditional thin, narrow blades simply could not absorb the enormous power of the R2800. At high speeds and altitudes, they lost efficiency, leaving the Jug struggling. Republic's engineers proposed a radical alternative, a broader, paddle-shaped propeller blade designed to bite into the air with far greater force. But testing and production took time. And time was the one thing the 8th Air Force was running out of. By the end of 1943, the Allies faced a sobering reality. Unless something changed, Germany would retain its mastery of the skies. Every day the bombers flew. Hundreds of American airmen gambled with their lives. The Thunderbolt needed a transformation. And soon, the paddle blade propeller would arrive, just as the air war reached its breaking point. By late 1943, the American daylight bombing campaign hung by a thread. Losses were staggering. Young airmen who had trained for months were being wiped from the skies in a matter of weeks. On October 14th, Black Thursday, the dream of daylight precision bombing nearly died. The mission, a return strike on the ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Without these vital parts, German tanks, planes and trucks would grind to a halt. But the Luftwaffe was waiting. As the bombers crossed into Germany, waves of fighters struck in coordinated attacks. Messerschmitts from above, Focke-Wulfs from the side, and cannon fire raking through the formations. The escorts, brave P-47 pilots, fought savagely. But when their fuel gauges dipped, they had no choice but to turn back. The bombers pressed on alone. What followed was slaughter. 60 B-17s fell in flames that day. Over 600 airmen killed or captured. The survivors returned to their bases in England, eyes hollow, faces blackened with smoke. Ground crews wept openly on the tarmac as they counted the missing. One gunner, barely 20 years old, wrote home. The sky was full of fire and broken wings. I don't set know how I made it back. I don't set know why I did, when so many didn't. The losses shocked Washington and London. Even General Hap Arnold, the head of the Army Air Forces, feared the campaign might be unsustainable. He admitted privately, "We are throwing our boys against a stone wall." The Luftwaffe's confidence soared. Their aces boasted that the American air offensive had been broken. One German officer remarked, "The skies belong to the Reich. Let them come, and they will burn." But in the shadows of this crisis, hope flickered. In hangars across England, ground crews began fitting Thunderbolts with a new kind of propeller, broad paddle-shaped blades, designed to harness the raw fury of the R2800 engine. Pilots noticed the difference immediately. The Jug no longer struggled to climb, it surged. In dives it tore through the sky like a falling star, and suddenly, the heavy anvil with wings had teeth sharp enough to match the Germans blow for blow. But in those dark days of 1943, no one knew for certain if the gamble would work or if the bomber offensive would collapse before the transformation reached the front lines. The breaking point had arrived. Either the skies over Europe would remain Germany's domain, or the Jug's rebirth would change the course of the war. The winter of 1943-44 brought a quiet revolution to the airfields of England. One by one, P-47 Thunderbolts rolled out of maintenance hangars fitted with a new radical feature, the broad paddle blade propeller. At first glance, it seemed a small change, just reshaped blades of metal. But in flight, it was nothing less than transformation. Pilots felt it the moment they throttled forward. The Jug leapt off the runway with new urgency. At altitude where the old prop had choked the engine's power, the new blades gripped the air with ferocity. Climb rates improved dramatically. The lumbering giant could now ascend nearly as fast as a Messerschmitt. In level flight, its speed edged toward 470 miles per hour, putting it squarely in the realm of the Luftwaffe's best. And in a dive, the Jug became terrifying. German pilots soon learned the hard way. A Thunderbolt in full dive was almost untouchable, a steel juggernaut streaking from the heavens. The first missions with the new props shocked the Luftwaffe. Where once German fighters could climb out of reach, now Thunderbolts were on their tails. Where once the Jug had lagged, now it roared. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, already a rising ace, described the difference. Before, we fought hard to keep them in sight. Now we had the speed to choose the fight and the power to finish it. In January 1944, during missions over Western Germany, the new Thunderbolts proved their worth. One pilot recalled diving through a swarm of 190 sets, blasting one from the sky, pulling up, and finding his Jug still eager to climb, eager to fight again. The Germans were stunned. Adolf Galland, the famed Luftwaffe general, later admitted, "The arrival of the improved Thunderbolt signaled a new and dangerous phase. The Americans had found their claws." For the bomber crews, the difference was life itself. Now, when the formations pressed deeper into Germany, the Thunderbolts stayed longer, fought harder, and struck back with ferocity. The days of helplessly watching escorts turn back were beginning to fade. Still, the Luftwaffe was not finished. Even as Thunderbolts grew deadlier, German tactics adapted. They attacked with larger groups, struck at the bombers with head-on assaults, and fought with desperate fury. But the balance had shifted. For the first time, American pilots felt not like prey, but like hunters. The paddle blade propeller had unlocked the Jug's true nature, a 470-mile-per-hour monster of the skies. Yet even this was not the end. For as the Thunderbolt grew stronger, new strategies emerged, plans that would carry the fight deep into the heart of Hitler's Reich and test whether the Jug could truly break Germany's grip on the skies. By early 1944, the US 8th Air Force was ready to gamble again. Armed with upgraded Thunderbolts, and supported by the arrival of the long-range P-51 Mustang, the Allies launched a new phase of the air war, Operation Argument. But among pilots, it was given another name, the Big Week. The plan was daring. For 7 relentless days in February, bomber streams would hammer Germany's aircraft factories, supply chains, and fuel depots. The goal was not only to cripple production, but to draw the Luftwaffe into battle, to break its spine in the skies. And this time, the Thunderbolt was ready. With their paddle blade props, the Jugs now fought on equal terms with the German interceptors. They flew higher, faster, and longer. Instead of peeling away early, they lingered, circling above, diving into German attacks, striking with raw force. One pilot later recalled, "We weren't set just covering the bombers anymore, we were hunting. Every time Jerry came up, we met him head-on." The Thunderbolt's firepower was devastating. 8.50 caliber Browning machine guns, firing in synchronized fury, could soar through wings, engines, and cockpits in seconds. In the chaos of Big Week, P-47 Thunderbolt ripped into German formations, sending Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs spiraling down in flames. But strategy went beyond simply meeting the enemy. American commanders ordered their fighters to pursue retreating Luftwaffe planes, to chase them down even after they broke contact. It was a radical shift. Fighters no longer stayed glued to the bombers, but carried the fight to the enemy's very doorstep. For the Germans, this was a nightmare. Every mission became bloodier. Factories were bombed, repair shops destroyed, veteran aces killed in dogfights. New pilots, barely trained, were thrown into the fire, only to be cut down by experienced Thunderbolt and Mustang squadrons. By the end of Big Week, the Luftwaffe was staggering. They had lost hundreds of aircraft, and worse, irreplaceable pilots. The Jug, once mocked as slow and clumsy, had become one of the chief instruments of their destruction. But the cost was still high. American losses remained heavy, and the skies over Germany were far from safe. The struggle was not yet won. Still, a shift had begun. For the first time, the Allies were not simply surviving in the skies over Europe, they were seizing them. And the Jugset's finest hour was still to come. By the spring of 1944, the air war over Europe reached its decisive turning point. The Luftwaffe, once the hunter, now found itself hunted. Every mission the Americans launched forced the Germans to respond. The Reich's factories, oil depots, and aircraft assembly lines were lifelines too precious to leave undefended. But each time the Luftwaffe rose to fight, it bled. The upgraded Thunderbolt was at the heart of this reversal. Its paddle blade propellers turned it from a heavy escort into a predator. No longer forced to lag behind, the Jug Dove with crushing speed tore through German formations and climbed back with a roar of victory. One veteran Luftwaffe pilot described his shock after being bounced by a Thunderbolt. "We thought they could not follow us in the climb, but suddenly they were there, faster, heavier, and they would not break away." The climax came not in a single battle, but in a relentless grinding down of the Luftwaffe's strength. During Big Week and the months that followed, German losses mounted beyond recovery. In March 1944, raids on Berlin itself brought the Jug and its fellow escorts into the very heart of Hitler's Reich. On those missions, bomber crews who had once flown into certain death now saw Thunderbolts tearing through the swarms of interceptors, scattering them in all directions. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, reflecting on those days, said, "The Jug had become everything we dreamed it could be. We were no longer praying to survive. We were there to win." The numbers told the story. Between February and June 1944, the Luftwaffe lost more than 5,000 aircraft and many of its most experienced pilots. Factories could still produce planes, but they could not produce men. The Luftwaffe's backbone had been shattered. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, the transformation was complete. The skies belonged to the Allies. And the Thunderbolt, the once mocked flying Jug, had become one of the most feared fighters in Europe. But its role was not over. With the Luftwaffe crippled, the Jug found a new mission, one that would bring it low over the battlefields, trading duels in the clouds for thunder and fire on the ground. The monster that had conquered the skies was about to become the hammer of the battlefield. By mid-1944, the skies over Europe no longer belonged to the Luftwaffe. The price had been high, but the reversal was complete. American bombers could now strike deep into Germany with unprecedented protection, and the Luftwaffe, once the pride of Hitler's war machine, was a shadow of its former self. Yet the Thunderbolt's story did not end with air superiority. With the Luftwaffe broken, the Jug's sheer size, ruggedness, and firepower made it perfect for a new role: ground attack. Flying low and fast, P-47 squadrons became the scourge of German armor and supply lines. Equipped with bombs, rockets, and its 8.50 caliber guns, the Thunderbolt tore apart trains, convoys, tanks, and artillery. One German soldier later recalled, "We feared the Thunderbolt more than the artillery. When it came like a storm of iron." For Allied troops on the ground, the Jug became a guardian angel. Infantrymen advancing through Normandy watched in awe as P-47 swept overhead, hammering German positions, silencing machine guns, and smashing armored columns. To them, it was not the Jug, it was salvation. But for the men who flew it, the price remained steep. Low-level attacks exposed Thunderbolt pilots to deadly anti-aircraft fire. Many never came back. Letters recovered from their effects speak of quiet acceptance. "If my luck runs out, know that I believe in what we say doing. The Jug is my shield, and I still fly her until the end." By war's end, the P-47 had flown more than 500,000 combat sorties. It destroyed thousands of enemy aircraft in the air and tens of thousands of vehicles and targets on the ground. No Allied fighter claimed more destruction. And yet, behind the statistics lay the faces of young men who had lived through fire and steel. Some returned home as aces, celebrated and decorated. Others came home changed, carrying the weight of memories no medal could ease. Too many never returned at all. The Thunderbolt had proven itself beyond question, transformed from a heavy, mocked machine into a weapon of relentless destruction. But its greatest testament was not the speed records it broke or the planes it downed. It was the lives it saved, the bomber crews who made it back because the Jug stood guard, the soldiers who advanced because the Jug thundered overhead. And yet, history reminds us, every victory came at a cost. The Thunderbolt's story is as much about sacrifice as it is about triumph. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt began its life mocked as too heavy, too sluggish, too late to matter. But, in the crucible of war, it became something else entirely. a fighter that not only survived the skies of Europe, but mastered them. The paddle blade propeller was more than just an engineering upgrade. It was a reminder of how small changes can unlock hidden power, how persistence in the darkest moments can turn defeat into triumph. It gave the Jug the speed to strike back, the climb to chase the enemy, the strength to dive like thunder. For the airmen, it was a second chance. Bomber crews who once flew into certain death now looked out their windows to see Jugs holding the line. Infantrymen pushing through Normandy knew that when the Jug arrived, survival followed. The numbers alone are staggering: over 113,000 built, more than 500,000 sorties flown, countless enemy aircraft destroyed, and immeasurable lives saved. But the true legacy of the Thunderbolt is written not in statistics, but in the courage of the men who flew it. They were young, often no older than 20. They carried fear, but also hope. They fought not only for victory, but for each other. The Jug, for all its steel and firepower, was merely the vessel of their will, their sacrifice. Today, when we see a restored Thunderbolt at an airshow, its radial engine rumbling like distant thunder, we are reminded not only of a machine, but of an era when the fate of nations was decided in the clouds, and of how innovation, courage, and sacrifice turned the tide of history. If this story moved you, remember, history is more than dates and battles. It is courage discovered in despair, sacrifice forged in fire, and lessons carried forward to us today. This was the story of the Thunderbolt, the Jug that became a monster. For more echoes of courage, sacrifice, and humanity in the Second World War, join us again. Like, comment, and subscribe to keep these voices alive.